The hospital hallway smelled like bleach and hopelessness. Billionaire Martin Vance stood outside the ICU, staring through the glass at his only son, 9-year-old Theo, who lay unconscious, hooked to wires and machines that beeped like reminders of time running out. The best doctors in the country had flown in, studied charts, whispered in corners, and then finally told him the one thing no money could change. "There's nothing more we can do." Martin hadn't cried when his company collapsed and rose again. He hadn't cried when his wife walked out with a note and silence. But now, watching his little boy's chest rise and fall unnaturally, his legs gave out. He slid down the wall, face in his hands, silent sobs shaking his shoulders in a place where no status mattered. Nurses passed by quietly, careful not to look too long. Everyone knew who he was: Martin Vance, the tech empire king, the man who rebuilt cities and crushed competitors. But tonight, he was just a father watching his son slip away. He had tried everything: the top neurologists, experimental drugs, even private shamans flown in under NDAs. Theo remained unresponsive. His brain trauma, they said, was too severe, too complicated, too final. Martin didn't want sympathy. He wanted hope. Just an inch of it. He would pay $1 billion for a single breath that didn't sound like the end. But no one could give him that. Not yet. Then, while the night, staff changed shifts and the halls dimmed to a soft blue glow, a voice came from behind him, quiet, unsure. "Sir, I think I can help." Martin looked up, expecting a doctor, a nurse, maybe even a volunteer. Instead, standing there was a janitor, gray uniform, gloves in one hand, a mop bucket squeaking beside him. His eyes were kind, older, worn, not confident but deeply sincere. Martin blinked, not understanding. "What did you say?" The janitor stepped closer. "Your son. I believe I can help him. I've seen this before." He looked almost embarrassed for speaking, but he didn't walk away. Martin stood, unsure whether to be angry or desperate. His voice was cracked. "You clean floors. What could you possibly know about my son?" The janitor didn't flinch. He looked past Martin, through the ICU window, at the small boy wrapped in wires. "He's not lost yet," he said. "You've tried the science, but not the silence, the stillness. I can't explain it in your terms, but I've helped before. One child. Years ago. Same look in the eyes." Martin stared, something between fury and fear rising in him. Was this madness, grief hallucination, or something else? Something ancient and unspoken. The janitor's name was Elias, and he didn't offer proof, just presence. "I don't want your money," he added. "I only ask you to listen and trust." Martin hesitated. But what did he have left to lose? They were already preparing to unplug machines in 3 days. He looked once more at Theo, then back at Elias. And though it made no sense, he found himself saying, "All right, tell me what you need." Elias only nodded, eyes steady. "I need 1 hour, and I need you not to interrupt, no matter what happens." The clock on the wall ticked forward, and the healing began, not in the body, but in something far deeper. Theo wasn't like other children. He didn't demand attention, didn't throw tantrums when his father missed dinner again, didn't complain when the house was too quiet. Instead, he painted, hours at a time, small, strange pictures of suns with sad eyes, trees that bent toward broken benches, and people holding invisible hands. No one noticed them but the housekeeper, who quietly saved each one. Theo didn't talk much, especially after the accident. He just stared, through people, through walls, like his soul was floating somewhere the rest of him couldn't follow. But there was something in his silence. Not emptiness, but waiting. Martin never intended to become distant. He loved Theo with every exhausted cell in his body. But running an empire meant choices, ugly, invisible sacrifices. He'd hired tutors, trainers, therapists, bought the boy everything, guitars, puzzles, even a private telescope. But he'd missed the small things, like how Theo flinched when lightning struck, how he clutched a faded teddy bear even when wearing $1,000 suits, and how every year on the same day, he locked himself in his room and cried into a pillow. Martin thought it was just a phase. He never asked why. Now, watching that small hand lifeless under hospital sheets, he'd give anything to go back and listen. Elias entered the room without a stethoscope or clipboard. Just a small folded cloth and a strange pendant that glowed faintly in his palm. Martin watched from behind the glass, flanked by skeptical nurses and security guards ordered to wait. "He's not hurting anyone," Martin had told them. "Let him try." Inside, Elias moved like someone who'd done this before. He didn't speak to Theo like he was asleep. He spoke like they were old friends. "Hello again," he whispered. "I was wondering when you'd find your way here." Then, placing a gentle hand over Theo's chest, Elias closed his eyes. The machines kept beeping. But something in the air shifted, like the weight of the world took a breath. The innocence Elias saw in Theo wasn't just youth. It was something purer. Theo had been protecting something, a memory, a secret, a tether that kept his soul hanging between two worlds. Elias didn't need to diagnose it. He could feel it. "You're not broken," he whispered. "You're just waiting for someone to remember." Outside, Martin leaned against the glass, watching this stranger talk to his son like they shared an ancient language. Nurses exchanged glances, unsure whether to call psych or let it be. But then, for the first time in weeks, Theo's fingers twitched. Just once, but enough to freeze every breath in the room. In another lifetime, Elias had been a healer. Not a doctor, not a miracle worker, but someone who carried pain for others, the way a fire carries warmth and danger. He lost his daughter long ago, a girl with the same eyes as Theo. Hospitals failed her. Science gave up. But one night, when Elias sat by her bed whispering old songs from his village, her eyes opened one last time. She smiled, touched his cheek, and said, "Thank you for not forgetting me." Since then, he'd carried that moment everywhere. Working, jobs no one noticed, cleaning floors no one respected, waiting quietly for the next soul that called to him without sound. And tonight, that soul was Theo. Theo's innocence wasn't just about age. It was about endurance. He had survived things he couldn't name. Loneliness masked by gold. Fear hidden behind quiet smiles. He had watched his mother walk away. Watched his father become a shadow of himself. He'd held in tears during every award ceremony where Martin apologized to the audience for missing Theo's school play. But he never turned bitter. Even in pain, he painted. Even in silence, he dreamed. Elias saw that. How the boy's spirit still held out a hand, hoping someone would hold it back. That's what healing meant to Elias. Not fixing the body, but honoring the ache. As Elias hummed softly, the machines flickered. Nothing dangerous, just different. A nurse gasped as Theo's eyelids fluttered. Martin stood paralyzed, but Elias remained calm. "Don't rush," he whispered. "Come, back at your pace." Tears welled in Martin's eyes, not because of science or surprise, but because he suddenly realized how much he had missed, how many birthdays he'd worked through, how many bedtimes he'd promised to make up for, and how even now, a stranger saw his son more clearly than he ever had. Guilt was a heavy coat, and Martin was finally ready to take it off. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small item, a marble, blue, cracked, worn. "This," he told Theo, "was once given to me by a child just like you." She said it helped her feel brave. He placed it gently in Theo's hand. "Now it's yours." The boy's fingers curled slightly around it. Martin choked back a cry. A billionaire, brought to his knees not by failure, but by the fragile grip of a sleeping child and a janitor's voice full of sorrow and light. And in that room something shifted, not just in Theo, but in everyone watching. Sympathy turned to reverence. Doubt turned to belief. Theo's innocence was a mirror, and everyone who looked into it, nurses, guards, his father, saw the parts of themselves they'd lost, their younger selves, the dreams they gave up, the kindness they forgot. Elias had known this would happen. It always did when truth was spoken gently, without ego. He stood up slowly, his task unfinished but in motion. "Let him rest," he said. "He's on his way back now." Martin rushed into the room, dropped beside his son, and pressed his forehead to Theo's hand. It was warm. For the first time in weeks, it was warm. And though Theo didn't open his eyes yet, he whispered something. So soft, only Elias heard it. "I remember." Martin had never questioned his moral compass, because success had always justified everything. Every missed family dinner, every broken friendship, every layoff, every deal made in back rooms under pressure and pride. It was all part of the climb. He had grown used to applause drowning out conscience. But that night in the hospital, standing beside a janitor who had reached his son when billions of dollars couldn't, something broke open in him. Not loudly, but slowly, painfully. He saw the truth, clear as glass. His success had built an empire, but it had also built a wall, one that kept out love, vulnerability, and time, the only three things his son had ever truly needed. The next morning, Martin didn't return to his penthouse. He sat by Theo's bed, holding his hand while he breathed. Elias had asked for nothing in return, no payment, no recognition. He simply vanished after whispering one last line. "When love is quiet, it heals loudest." Martin kept hearing those words on loop. The next morning, Martin didn't return to his penthouse. He sat by Theo's bed, holding his hand while he breathed. Elias had asked for nothing in return, no payment, no recognition. He simply vanished after whispering one last line. "When love is quiet, it heals loudest." Martin kept hearing those words on loop. They made him think of all the people who had shown up in his life quietly. His college roommate who once paid his rent when he had nothing, a secretary who stayed late just to make sure his sick wife's medication was delivered on time, his own father who never said much but always kept the porch light on when Martin came home late. Martin had mistaken silence for irrelevance, and now he understood how wrong that was. He remembered the board meeting last year, when he'd fired a man who refused to approve a deal involving land evictions. "Morality doesn't scale," Martin had said coldly. That sentence haunted him now. How many decisions had he made in that same cold tone? How many hearts had he broken because margins mattered more than meaning? Sitting beside Theo's hospital bed, he didn't see graphs anymore. He saw faces, names, families. He saw the janitor who healed his son with nothing but presence and truth. And for the first time, he felt something sharper than guilt. He felt the need to make it right. He called his assistant and canceled the next 3 months of meetings. He told her to prepare statements for restructuring the company. "We've lost our soul," he said quietly, "and I intend to find it again." She was stunned, but didn't argue. Martin wasn't yelling, wasn't commanding. He was different, grounded, heavy with purpose. He began reading every letter of complaint the company had received, every lawsuit they settled quietly. He met with workers anonymously, not as a CEO, but as a man trying to understand the damage his ambition had caused. Some forgave, some didn't. But all of them listened, surprised by the change in his eyes. Theo woke up 2 days later, eyes fluttering open like petals in spring. He didn't speak much, just stared at his father for a long time. Then, in a whisper, asked, "Are you staying this time?" Martin broke. He nodded, holding his son's hand with both of his. "Forever, if you'll let me." It was in that moment that the real awakening happened, not just moral, but spiritual. Martin had spent his life controlling outcomes, building futures with blueprints and deadlines, but healing, forgiveness, redemption, they couldn't be engineered. They had to be earned. And sometimes, they had to be received without fully understanding how they came. Martin later visited the janitor's quarters. It was small, modest, filled with old books and handmade trinkets. But Elias wasn't there. No one knew where he went. Some said he'd quit. Others claimed they'd never hired anyone by that name. All Martin found was a note taped to the wall. "Remember, it's not what you build, it's who you lift." He stood in that room for a long time, clutching the note. Then he smiled for the first time in weeks. Because he knew now. Elias had never needed recognition. He had already done his work. The rest was up to Martin. He began funding children's hospitals anonymously, not in his name, but in Theo's. He rebuilt school art programs, created scholarships for students who painted like Theo once did. And every week, without fail, he volunteered at the hospital, not as Martin Vance, the billionaire, but as a man in plain clothes who cleaned trays, read to children, and sat quietly with grieving parents. It wasn't a PR move. He refused to allow cameras or reports. He wasn't chasing redemption points. He was chasing something deeper, peace, purpose. And the quiet knowing that maybe, just maybe, he could become the kind of man Elias had already believed he could be. The room was quiet, too quiet. The machines beeped in a distant rhythm, and outside the window, soft rain began to fall. Martin sat beside Theo's bed, cradling the boy's hand like it was the last fragile piece of his shattered heart. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. His empire could collapse tomorrow, and he wouldn't care. His son, his only son, was in a coma, and for the first time in Martin's life, he couldn't buy a solution. He couldn't negotiate, delegate, or threaten his way out. He just had to sit there and feel it, all of it. And then, something happened. Theo's fingers moved, just slightly like the flutter of a bird's wing. Martin sat up, eyes wide, heart slamming against his chest. "Theo?" he whispered. The boy didn't respond, but his eyelids twitched. His breathing shifted. Martin leaned closer, barely breathing himself. "I'm here, son. I'm not going anywhere. Please, please come back." He said it not like a CEO, but like a broken father begging the universe for mercy. A tear slipped down his cheek. It wasn't the first. It wouldn't be the last. But it was the first one Theo ever felt land on his skin. Suddenly, the door opened. Elias stepped in quietly, a towel in his hand, as if he'd simply come to clean. But he stopped when he saw Martin's trembling shoulders. He placed the towel down and stood beside the bed. "He's almost here," Elias said softly. Martin looked at him, desperate, clinging to hope like a man clings to a ledge. "You said that before, but how do you know?" Elias knelt beside Theo and placed a hand on the boy's chest. "Because he's listening, not with ears but with his soul, and souls always respond to love." Martin looked back at his son, and his heart cracked wide open. "I'm sorry," Martin whispered, voice shaking. "I wasn't there. I wasn't enough. I thought giving you the world would make up for missing your world." He placed his forehead on Theo's arm. "I forgot who I was before the money, before the titles. I forgot how to be your dad." Elias stepped back, silent, letting the moment live on its own. And then, in the stillness, Theo's lips moved. Not a word, just a shape, a silent echo. Martin leaned in, breath caught in his throat. "Dad," Theo mouthed. It was weak, it was broken, but it was enough. Martin collapsed into tears, holding his son like he'd just been born again. The machines began to stabilize. A nurse rushed in, calling for a doctor, but Martin didn't move. He was frozen, wrapped in a moment so full of emotion it burned. Theo opened his eyes slowly, squinting at the light. "You came back," he said hoarsely. Martin nodded, unable to speak. Theo smiled, barely, then whispered, "You don't have to be perfect. Just be here." That line hit Martin harder than any boardroom failure or press scandal ever had. It was forgiveness, pure, undiluted. Elias stood behind them, eyes wet, then quietly left the room. He knew his part in this story was over. The healing had begun. Elias never spoke of his past. He never bragged about the people he'd helped or the pain he'd endured. He was a man of few words and even fewer demands. The hospital staff barely noticed him, except for how spotless the halls stayed or how children smiled when he passed. What no one knew, what Martin would only learn much later, was that Elias once had a son too, a boy who looked just like Theo, with soft brown eyes and a curious mind, a boy who never got the chance to grow up because the system failed, because the money wasn't there, because someone more powerful said no one too many times. Elias had tried everything: charity, clinics, appeals, home remedies, but in the end, all he had left was prayer. And when that didn't work, he didn't get angry. He got quiet. He picked up a mop, not because he had to, but because he needed to be close to where healing still happened. Because if he couldn't save his own son, maybe he could help save someone else's. He never told the doctors who he really was. He never submitted a resume that showed the 2 medical degrees he once held in another country. His license had expired with his son's last breath, and since then, Elias had only lived to give quietly. That night, when Elias saw Theo unconscious, on the hospital bed, something in his eyes shifted, but only for a moment. He stepped in not to impress Martin, but because he recognized the fear in a father's eyes. It mirrored the same look he once wore. When Martin demanded answers, Elias gave none. When the doctors questioned his presence, he simply said, "Let me try." He stayed up all night at Theo's bedside, chanting soft words in another language, rubbing pressure points gently, whispering memories only a father would say. When Martin returned in the morning, exhausted and heartbroken, Elias was already gone like mist at sunrise. He didn't wait for praise. He didn't ask for thanks. He just left behind a folded note and an origami bird made from a hospital menu. On the note were 3 words: Be his dad. That was it. No signature, no explanation, just truth carved into paper by a man who had lost everything, yet still chose to give more. Elias had never wanted anything in return. His reward was silent, the kind that lives in the way a boy blinks open his eyes, or the way a man finds his way back to love. His sacrifice wasn't loud, it was invisible, and that made it even more powerful. Martin spent days searching for him. He offered rewards, reviewed every staff file, even asked the media for leads. But there was no trace. Elias had disappeared, without a footprint. Some said he was never hired at all, that his name wasn't in any database. Others believed he was a guardian angel sent in the disguise of a janitor. Martin didn't care what anyone said. He knew what he felt. Elias had given his heart, his wisdom, his time, and had walked away asking for nothing but for Martin to become the father Theo needed. It was the kind of sacrifice that rewrites destinies, quiet, selfless, eternal. Martin was no stranger to control. His whole life had been about conquering, commanding, and winning. But nothing he'd ever built, no tower of steel, no multi-million-dollar deal, could prepare him for this. Sitting beside Theo's fragile frame, every breath became a battle, every hour an enemy. He didn't care about the board meetings he was missing or the headlines speculating his absence. He only cared about the tiny flicker of life in the boy, who once called him Super Dad. And in that hospital room, with the scent of antiseptic clinging to his suit, Martin made a vow that no amount of money could buy him out of. "I won't lose you," he whispered. His voice cracked, but the fire in his chest was steady, the kind of fire that burns not with rage, but with fierce protective love. Every doctor's hesitation, every nurse's uncertain glance only added fuel to that fire. Martin transformed that night, from a man who bought solutions to a father who would fight for one. He studied medical files like they were business, contracts, grilled specialists as if they were potential partners. He became relentless. Not arrogant, not aggressive, but driven. Because this wasn't just about keeping his son alive. It was about showing Theo that his father could show up, fully. Finally. The staff began to notice. The once imposing billionaire now spent nights in the ICU chair, adjusting Theo's blanket, talking to him in soft tones, reciting old bedtime stories. When a nurse offered him coffee, he said, "No thanks, I'm staying awake for him." He wasn't just watching, he was learning. He memorized medicine schedules, asked about therapies Elias had suggested, and refused to take "we don't know" as an answer. When the head surgeon warned him, "Mr. Lockwood, you can't control biology," Martin replied, "No, but I can control whether my son knows I'm fighting beside him." The board of his company begged him to return. Shareholders were nervous. But Martin sent one line in response: "A father's place is with his son." For the first time, his wealth didn't serve him. It bowed to him. He paid for the best, but he leaned most on the simplest, on Elias's strange herbal infusions, on whispered encouragement, on holding Theo's hand and refusing to let go. Not even when he was told the odds were slim. Not even when his own father told him, "You need to move on." Martin's answer was clear. "I didn't build my empire to lose what matters most." I'd trade it all for one more smile from him. And then came the moment that changed everything. Theo had a seizure. A violent, terrifying moment where machines screamed and nurses rushed in. Martin was shoved back, but he pushed forward again, yelling, "Do something! That's my son!" A nurse tried to calm him, but Martin's eyes were wild, protective, unyielding. And when the seizure ended and Theo went still, Martin dropped to his knees, silent, shaking. He prayed, something he hadn't done since he was a boy himself. "Please," he whispered, take everything. Just leave me him." That's when Elias entered, put a hand on Martin's shoulder and said, "He felt that. Keep going." From that moment on, Martin changed his mission. He wasn't just protecting his son's body, he was protecting his soul. He made Theo's room a sanctuary, filled with his favorite music, warm colors, even the scent of his favorite, cookies. He spoke to him like he was awake, reading him letters from his classmates, recording messages from his mom. Every moment became sacred, and though Martin still wore a suit, he moved like a soldier, watching, guarding, loving with a passion that had no ego left. The billionaire was gone. In his place was a father who finally understood what power truly meant. His determination spread like wildfire. Doctors started staying longer. Nurses began singing lullabies they hadn't used in years. One therapist said, "He's not just waking his son, he's waking this entire hospital." And it was true. People were different around Martin now, not because of his status, but because of his heart. A heart that had been bruised and blistered but was beating louder than ever. When he caught a nurse crying in the hallway, he didn't bark orders. He handed her tea and said, "We're all tired. Let's not give up on him." That's when people stopped calling him Sir and started calling him Theo's dad. One night, as Martin sat watching old home videos on his tablet, Theo's 3rd birthday, a splash in the pool, a cake with blue frosting, he saw his own face, distant even then, and it broke him. "I was there," he whispered, "but I wasn't really there." He wiped his tears and looked at the sleeping boy beside him. "But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving." He pulled the blanket up to Theo's chin and kissed his forehead. It didn't matter if Theo couldn't hear. Love finds its way, especially the kind that refuses to quit. Especially the kind that comes too late but shows up stronger than ever. Each morning, Martin now walked the hospital halls with purpose, not with entitlement. He greeted janitors by name, thanked every technician, and never once asked for special treatment. He'd learned that respect wasn't bought, it was earned, step by painful step. And when the media finally caught wind of his story, he refused interviews. "This isn't a story," he said. "It's my son's life." He wasn't protecting his reputation anymore. He was protecting his child's peace. And that kind of protection, it doesn't fade. It only grows stronger. Day by day, hour by hour, heartbeat by heartbeat. Martin Lockwood had always believed success was the ultimate redemption, that if he worked hard enough, earned big enough, and stayed powerful enough, the rest would fall into place. But sitting in the silence of his son's hospital room, he realized how hollow that belief truly was. The millions, the mansions, the meetings, they had bought him everything except the one thing that mattered now: time. And as he stared at Theo's pale face, a slow ache built inside his chest. A kind of ache money couldn't fix. He whispered, "I missed so much." And for the first time in years, he meant it. He remembered the missed school recitals, the birthdays celebrated over phone calls, the promises that always ended with, "Daddy's busy, but next time, okay?" There had always been a next time, until there wasn't. He thought of the questions Theo used to ask. "Why don't you tuck me in?" Or, "Do you have to work on Sunday again?" And how easy it had been to dodge them. Now those questions haunted him. Now he'd give anything for another chance to answer them the right way. The guilt weighed on him like armor, heavy and cold. But inside that armor, something began to crack. The beginning of change. One morning, he found a drawing in Theo's backpack that the nurses had set aside. It showed a stick figure of a boy and a taller man holding hands. The boy had a big smile. The man had a briefcase and a sad face. In crayon, Theo had written, "Maybe when he's done being busy, he'll play with me." Martin stared at that drawing until his eyes blurred. It wasn't just a child's doodle. It was a mirror, a reflection of all the years he thought he was providing when what his son really needed was presence. And suddenly, success felt like failure in disguise. Martin knew he couldn't rewrite the past, but he could choose what came next. So he began the quiet work of redemption. He called his assistant and asked her to clear his calendar, indefinitely. He reached out to his ex-wife, not to argue or apologize with excuses, but to ask for forgiveness. "You were right," he said. "I wasn't there the way I should have been." And though her silence stung, it was honest. It was deserved. Redemption, he learned, wasn't about grand gestures. It was about consistency, humility, the kind of love that rebuilds slowly, brick by brick. He started showing up differently, not just for Theo, but for everyone. He listened more. He judged less. He thanked the janitor. He sat with the nervous parents in the ICU waiting room and shared his coffee. When a child in the next room cried out in pain, he stood up to find help. He no longer saw strangers. He saw sons, daughters, parents, stories. Every face reminded him of what he almost lost. Every breath Theo took became a lesson, and every small act of compassion felt like a thread sewing his torn soul back together. He was learning, one moment at a time. One afternoon, the head nurse approached him and said, "We've never seen someone change the way you have." Martin looked at her, eyes tired but warm, and said, "It took almost losing everything to see what I had." He didn't need approval. He needed truth. And the truth was, he hadn't been the man his son deserved. But now, he was becoming him. With every story he read aloud to Theo, every song he played softly by the bed, every gentle "I'm here" whispered through the night, Martin was building something new, not an empire, but a legacy of presence, of love, of showing up. Elias watched quietly from the shadows, never seeking credit. He saw the change in Martin, not just as a father, but as a man. And one evening, as Martin folded Theo's blanket and hummed softly, Elias approached and said, "Redemption isn't earned by regret. It's proven by love." Martin nodded, tears in his eyes. "I'm trying," he said. Elias smiled. "You already are." It was the kind of exchange that needed no applause, just understanding. Two fathers, both broken, both healing. One guiding. One growing. And in that moment, Martin felt something lift. Shame giving way to purpose. He began journaling every day, writing letters to Theo he hoped to read aloud when his son woke up. Letters that began with, "I'm sorry," but ended with, "I'm better now." He knew the past couldn't be erased, but it could be forgiven. And forgiveness, he realized, had to start from within. One night, as he sat beside Theo's bed, he read one of the letters aloud. "You don't have to be proud of me yet. Just know I love you more than anything, and I'm not going anywhere. Not again." A tear slipped down his cheek, and he held Theo's hand, whispering, "We'll build from here." His team sent him reports, crisis updates, urgent requests, but he ignored them. His fortune could recover. His company could wait. His son could not. And though the world outside judged him, speculated on his absence, questioned his silence, Martin didn't care. The only judgment that mattered now was his own, and maybe, someday, his son's. Redemption was not a single act. It was a choice, daily, humble, and hard. It was waking up every day and choosing to love better than the day before. And slowly, day by day, Martin Lockwood was becoming the kind of man he once thought he never had time to be. The night was unusually quiet, almost too quiet, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. Machines hummed softly in Theo's room, casting dim lights across his fragile body. Martin sat still, staring at his son, 1,000 thoughts swirling, but none louder than the terror of losing him. Doctors had warned of a critical window and, tonight, they said, would decide everything. Every beep of the monitor felt like a countdown, each second slicing through Martin's heart like glass. In the hallway, a nurse rushed past, whispering to another in hushed urgency, "His vitals are dropping again." Martin's stomach dropped. "No," he murmured, standing up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. He ran to the door, but they gently stopped him, saying, "We need a moment. Please wait outside." As the door closed in front of him, Martin leaned his forehead against the cold glass, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Behind that door was his entire world, and he couldn't do a thing. But across the corridor, Elias stood up slowly, his face calm yet determined. He walked straight to the lead doctor. "Let me in," he said, his voice soft but sure. The doctor looked baffled. "Mr. Elias, with all due respect, this is beyond your expertise." Elias met his gaze without flinching. "I told you before, I know what's wrong with that boy. I've seen this once in my past. The same symptoms, the same misdiagnosis. If you don't act now, he will slip away." The room fell silent. Every second mattered. And suddenly the doctor said, "Show me." Inside the room, nurses moved quickly. Elias stepped closer to Theo, pulled up the sheets gently and whispered, "Stay with me, little one." He pointed to a small discoloration on Theo's abdomen. "He's not rejecting the treatment, he's reacting to something in the compound, likely the stabilizer used in the last dosage." "You're treating the wrong cause." The doctor scanned the area, his expression shifting from skepticism to alarm. "You might be right. Prepare a reversal dose immediately," the doctor shouted. The team scrambled into action as Martin watched, helplessly from outside. The next hour passed like a storm, rushing doctors, crashing carts, tense whispers. Martin felt like he was underwater, holding his breath through every second. Finally, the doors opened, and Elias stepped out, his face unreadable. Martin ran up to him, grabbing his arms. "Please, is he okay?" Elias looked at him for a moment before the faintest smile broke across his face. "He's breathing. The fever is breaking. You've got him back." Martin collapsed against the wall, his knees giving out. Relief flooded him like rain after drought. But more than relief, it was awe. Elias sat beside him on the bench, silent at first. Then Martin whispered, "How did you know? How did you save him when even the best doctors couldn't?" Elias looked down at his hands, calloused and worn. "Because once, a child I loved wasn't saved. I made a promise that day, that if I ever had the chance to give another child what I couldn't give mine, I wouldn't hesitate." Martin's throat tightened. He looked at Elias, not as a janitor now, but as a guardian, a healer, a man who had transformed quiet pain into purpose. The next morning, Theo opened his eyes slowly, blinking at the morning light. Martin was already at his side, gripping his hand. "Dad?" Theo croaked. Martin leaned in, tears spilling. "I'm here, buddy. I'm not going anywhere." The doctor confirmed what Elias had suspected. It was a rare allergy reaction, and Elias's intervention had saved Theo's life. Word spread through the hospital. Staff whispered not about Martin Lockwood's wealth, but about the janitor who saved a billionaire's son. Elias declined interviews. He just smiled and went back to cleaning the hallways, mop in hand, heart full. Martin called a press conference, not to talk about business, but to introduce Elias to the world. "This man," he said into the microphone, "taught me that healing doesn't just come from medicine. It comes from humanity, from humility, from love." The crowd fell silent. Reporters wept. Investors looked stunned. But Martin didn't care. He handed Elias the mic, but Elias simply said, "I did what any father would do," and walked off the stage. That moment became the thumbnail image of thousands of news articles. But for Martin and Elias, it was just another day of keeping a promise. That night, as the hospital lights dimmed and Theo slept peacefully, Martin stood beside Elias. In the hallway, "How do I ever repay you?" he asked. Elias shook his head. "Live better, love deeper, and never miss a chance to be present. That's all I ask." Martin nodded, emotion thick in his chest. In that moment, something shifted, not just in him, but in the world around him. A billionaire's heart had been broken open by a janitor's wisdom, and in the silence that followed, two fathers stood side by side, wounded, whole, and forever changed. The sun poured through the hospital windows the next morning, bathing the sterile hallways in a soft golden light. Martin sat at his son's bedside, holding Theo's tiny hand, watching the slow and steady rise of his chest as he slept. It felt like witnessing a miracle unfold in slow motion, each breath a testament to life reclaimed, each moment a reminder that love had no hierarchy. Beside him, a small handwritten note rested on the table. It read, "Don't forget why he's still here." Signed simply, Elias. No title, no glory, just the truth. Martin stepped out into the hallway, his eyes scanning for the man who had changed his life. He found Elias quietly mopping near the elevators, humming a tune only he seemed to know. Martin approached him with reverence, not as a billionaire, but as a father to another. "I don't want this to end here," Martin said softly. Elias paused, then smiled without turning. "Then don't let it. Change doesn't need a ceremony, just a decision." That single sentence landed deeper than any speech Martin had ever heard in a boardroom. 2 weeks later, news outlets began to cover the transformation of the Lockwood Corporation, not because of profit margins, but because of policies that suddenly prioritized people. Medical funds were created, education grants for hospital workers' families. A new foundation launched, the Theo Elias Initiative, dedicated to unseen heroes in everyday roles. But Elias stayed away from the limelight. He declined press calls, interviews, awards. Instead, he continued his quiet work, sweeping floors, sharing smiles, changing lives in ways that could never be measured by cameras. As Theo recovered and returned home, his laughter once again echoing through the halls of the Lockwood estate, Martin changed too. He spent more evenings at the dinner table than in meetings, more mornings reading stories than reading stock reports. He began mentoring young fathers who'd lost their way in ambition. His voice, once sharp with authority, softened into warmth. He often told Theo bedtime stories, but now one was repeated most. The story of the janitor who healed, not just a sick boy, but a broken man's soul. And every time, Theo would whisper, "Elias is my hero." Years passed, but the bond between Martin and Elias never faded. One Christmas, Martin brought Theo to the hospital not as a patient, but to volunteer beside Elias. They handed out blankets, shared cocoa, and listened to patients who had no one else. And at the end of the day, as the snow began to fall outside the hospital windows, Theo looked up at Elias and said, "You saved me before I even knew who you were. Now I want to be like you." Elias smiled, his eyes misty. Then the world is in good hands. In a world often blinded by titles, bank accounts, and social positions, one janitor's silent compassion lit a path toward something greater. Not just healing, but understanding. Not just success, but significance. Martin Lockwood, once seen as unreachable, became a living testament to what happens when humility meets transformation. And Elias? He remained where he always had been. Close to the ground, close to the people, close to the purpose. His mop may have looked like just a tool, but in his hands it was a wand of quiet miracles. As the credits of life rolled on, one thing became clear. Sometimes the most powerful stories begin not with headlines, but with whispers. Not with wealth, but with heart. And sometimes the greatest heroes wear no capes, sign no autographs, and claim no thrones. They simply show up, clean the mess, and in doing so, cleanse the wounds of others. Elias never needed recognition. He already had something most men spent their entire lives chasing: peace. And that was the most priceless gift of all.